Hi, my name is Pamela Coons, Associate Professor of Medicine in the Division of Oncology at Yale School of Medicine and Yale Cancer Center. I'm excited to announce ASCO's new open access journal, JCO Oncology Advances. As the inaugural editor-in-chief, I hope to support JCO Oncology Advances to become the premier platform to bridge the gap between accessible scientific research and clinical care. Stay tuned for more information, including new article types, at ascopubs.org/JCO Oncology Advances. We look forward to seeing your submissions in spring of 2024.
Hi, I'm Pat Loehrer. I'm Director of Global Oncology and Health Equities at Indiana University.
My name is Dave Johnson. I'm at UT Southwestern in Dallas. Pat, we're excited to be back for another segment of ASCO's educational podcast, Oncology, etc. We have two very special guests today, Drs. Ellen Baker and Robert Satcher, oncologists and former astronauts. So I predict this will be an out-of-this-world segment.
It's starting out pretty slow right now with that one. Thank you, though.
Well, listen, this should be a great segment. But before we get started, do you have a favorite astronaut book?
Well, the one I read this summer was called American Moonshot by Douglas Brinkley. And it basically took the story of John F. Kennedy and how the space race happened from 1960 and actually earlier than that into getting onto the moon. It was really, I thought, very extraordinary.
So I haven't read that yet. My favorite would be Rocket Boys by Homer Hickam. I thought that was a fantastic book about his life growing up in West Virginia and ultimately becoming a NASA engineer and rocket scientist. So that was really great.
I read that several years ago after you recommended it. Made a movie out of that.
Yeah, I think October Sky was the name of the movie. Yeah,
it's a terrific book.
Well, why don't we introduce our guests? You want to start with Dr. Baker?
Oh, sure. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ellen Baker. I have known Ellen over the years through interactions in global oncology. She was born in Fayetteville, North Carolina, graduated from Bayside High School in New York, got a Bachelor of Arts degree in geology from the State University at Buffalo, a doctorate in medicine for Cornell, master's in public health at UT Public Health, and then trained in internal medicine at UT San Antonio. And during her residency, she decided to join the NASA program as a medical officer. And it was actually, she did her residency around the same time I did. And I remember the space call for astronauts at that time. She was selected as an astronaut in May of 1984, had a variety of jobs. She's logged more than 680 hours in space and has been on a mission specialist. She retired from NASA in 2011 and is director of the MD Anderson Project ECHO program, in which she does projects in rural Texas, as well as Zambia, Mozambique, and Central and South America. It's such a great pleasure to have you here today, Ellen.
Thank you, Pat.
And our other guest is Dr. Robert Satcher, currently Associate Professor in the Department of Orthopedic Oncology, Division of Surgery at MD Anderson as well. Dr. Satcher grew up in Hampton, Virginia. He's the son of a university professor and an English teacher, so I'm sure they made him do all of his homework. He received a bachelor and a degree as well as a PhD in chemical engineering from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and received his MD degree from Harvard. By the way, Pat, Dr. Satcher enrolled at MIT at age 16 and graduated at the top of his class. Later, we'll find out what you were doing at age 16.
I do have to interject that I was a mechanical engineer at Purdue, and it's like being in high school compared to chemical engineers.
Yeah, there's a hierarchy in the engineering world, for sure. Dr. Satcher's medical degree was followed by internship and residency in orthopedic surgery at the University of California, San Francisco. In addition, he did a postdoc research fellowship again at MIT and University of California, Berkeley, and completed a fellowship in musculoskeletal oncology at the University of Florida before joining the faculty at Northwestern in Chicago. You guys have a lot of connections, it seems. Not satisfied with that massive amount of education and training, Dr. Satcher went on to NASA to train as an astronaut, culminating in a flight aboard the space shuttle Atlantis in November 2009. Apparently, he got a little bored cooped up in the shuttle because he took a couple of spacewalks, which I'd like to know more about. In fact, I read on NASA's website that he did some lubricating on one of his walks. I'm not sure what that's about, but I assume there's not a lot of gas stations in space. I also read that he repaired one of the robotic arms, which seems perfectly appropriate for an orthopedic surgeon. You'll have to tell us more. Anyway, while these achievements would be enough for most people, it only begins to scratch the surface of the many accomplishments of Dr. Satcher's career to date. I really can't cover it all, but our audience should know that Dr. Satcher has been involved in a number of community activities as well, ranging from his involvement in Big Brother for Youth at Risk counseling program to serving as a lay minister in his church. He's also undertaken a number of medical mission trips to underserved areas in countries such as Nicaragua, Venezuela, Nigeria, and Gabon, where he once served as a Schweitzer Fellow at the Albert Schweitzer Hospital in Green. Dr. Satcher, welcome to Oncology, etc. We very much appreciate your joining us.
Thanks, Dave. Glad to be here.
Perhaps I'll start by asking the two of you if you could give us just a little bit about your background other than what we've stated and what got you interested in medicine and how you got interested in space. Dr. Baker, maybe we'll start with you.
I've always been interested in space. I was a child of the 60s, and I think one of the very memorable parts of the 60s was the U.S. space program. It was a fairly tumultuous decade in the U.S., I think otherwise, and the space program was really literally a shining star. However, there were no girls in the space program at that time, right? There were no girl astronauts. And so I thought about it, but it didn't seem like it was even possible. I come from a family of medical people. My mother was a nurse. My father was a doctor. My brother is a doctor. And so that had a lot of influence, I think, in my choosing to go into medicine. And in fact, my brother is an oncologist. And though I am actually not an oncologist, I've been hanging around with him long enough that some people think I'm an oncologist. So I think that's what got me pointed in that direction.
Your brother is Larry Shulman, by the way, right? Humanitarian of the Year award from ASCO a couple years ago.
It is, yes. And he is a great humanitarian. I was actually in my last year of medical school when I saw a little article in the New York Times that NASA was selecting new astronauts and women and minorities were urged to apply. And I kind of filed that away and went off to do my medicine residency. And at the end of my residency, I applied to work for NASA as a physician. And that's sort of how I got to Houston and to Johnson Space Center.
And Dr. Satcher, what about yourself?
I got interested in space and being an astronaut when I was a kid, too. And it was watching the astronauts land on the moon. And I can, I was sitting there listening to what Ellen was saying. And it was a time where all the astronauts were, of course, white males. And I didn't, see myself there walking on the moon, but I knew it was something that I would really like to do, but didn't really see a pathway either at the time. So it really was with the shuttle era that women, people from underrepresented groups finally had the opportunity to become astronauts. And right around the same time, too, was when I was starting as an undergraduate at MIT and had the good fortune of meeting Ron McNair, who got his PhD from MIT. And that was the first time I ever saw someone who looked like me, who was an astronaut, and that planted the seed that maybe I could do that one day. I also come from, as you mentioned, a family that values education. And we had a number of physicians in our family, most famously my uncle, Dr. David Satcher, who was Surgeon General in the Clinton administration. And I always remember, this is a funny story I like to tell if he's listening, that, when I was going around getting advice on whether or not I should stick with medicine or think about applying to become an astronaut, he advised me just to stick with medicine. So I didn't take his advice. This is the one time I didn't, but I did take his advice in terms of going to medical school. And I wound up applying to become an astronaut right actually before the Columbia accident. And so they actually paused taking astronauts for a number of years. And in those years, actually, that's when I went to Northwestern and was on faculty there. So they opened it up again. And that's when I submitted my application. And I was in Chicago and was selected from there.
There's a number of questions that spill off from that. You guys may know David Wolf, who's an astronaut who's from Indiana University. I had him in my clinic when he was a medical student. And as I always do, I basically say, what do you want to do when you grow up? And he said, I want to be an astronaut. And I just smiled. And I don't think I ever went back in the room with him. I just figured this guy is a flake. What's going on with him? And I think he's logged more space miles than just about anybody. He's an incredible human being. And again, if he's listening, you're terrific, David. I just have to ask this as a boyhood thing, because I did contemplate being an astronaut because I was an engineer and MD, just like you were, Ellen. And so were you, Robbie. But it did hit me. One is you have not to be afraid of heights, I think. And then you have to be willing to go around in a circle 1,000 times a minute and not throw up. But in the training there, did any of that stuff bother you, or was this no big deal?
That sounds a little like Hollywood and not so much like the real thing, actually. In the early days of the space program, they did put astronauts in rotating chairs. I'm not exactly sure why, but we don't do that anymore. I would say that, the training is rigorous, but it's not unreasonable. I don't know what you think, Bobby. It's fairly predictable. And I will put a little shout out for Purdue, which maybe has one of the highest number of astronauts of any university outside the military academies. I don't know if that's true now, but 10 or 15 years ago, we just had a large number of engineers from Purdue who were in the astronaut office.
I agree. The training is, not quite how it's portrayed sometimes in the media. The question I get asked from my doctor friends a lot, I guess you can't be claustrophobic going into space because you're in the space capsule, and that really does deter a significant number of people, probably more than myself or Ellen appreciate, because I'm always surprised that I get that question.
So I'm 100% sure I couldn't be an astronaut if claustrophobia is an issue, because I can't stand to be in an elevator.
Let me step back a little. I don't want anybody to get discouraged, but you'd be surprised at how many pilots have a fear of heights if they're not encased in an airplane. So fear of heights is not necessarily something that you might worry about if you're an astronaut. And I disagree with you, Bobby. I don't think space vehicles are claustrophobic. It's not like being in a submarine, which I would find very claustrophobic, particularly in the shuttle, because we actually had great windows and great views, and you didn't confined. I don't know what you think, Bobby, but I didn't think it was like being in a cave or a closet or a submarine.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. It's the views are spectacular.
So William Shatner, as you know, just went up and had a brief stint in space and now considered an astronaut, but he came back with such a sense of awe. Can you describe a little bit what it's like, the view from up there, and how does it leave you, particularly your first time up in space?
The words don't completely capture it. The colors are so vivid. The view is so breathtaking. It's really impressive seeing the Earth, not only at daytime, but at nighttime. And just, it goes beyond. It's one of the few things I always tell people in life that really exceeded my expectation in terms of what my preconceived notion of what it would be. And ever since going, that's what's so addictive about going into space. It makes you want to go back just to see that again and experience it again. The closest that I've come to seeing anything like that is they have these new virtual reality experiences where they actually got footage that they shot in high def on the space station, outside the space station. It comes close in terms of the look, but it still doesn't fully capture it because the colors and everything aren't as clear and crisp as it is when you're there, because you're in the vacuum of space and there's nothing interfering with it. It's just spectacular.
I'll jump in here too, and I absolutely agree with Bobby. And the other thing is, you orbit the Earth every 90 minutes, so you cover a lot of ground and you see a lot of the planet. And, in that one orbit, you get a sunrise and a sunset. So you orbit the Earth 16 times a day and get 16 sunrises and sunsets. So every 45 minutes, the sun is either coming up or going down. It's really hard to know what time of day it is in terms of your workday on orbit, but it's just magnificent. And it did give me a sense that we're all from the same planet. And of course, it makes me wonder why we can't all get along better.
I think if people our age remember a few things. We remember the day Kennedy was shot. We remember the landing on the moon with Neil Armstrong. We also, sadly, remember the Challenger disaster and where we all were at that point in time. Ellen, you were an astronaut at that time.
I was.
Can you reflect a little bit about that? If you can, I'm not sure I could do it without getting emotional if I was there, but.
Yeah, I was actually at work, of course, and watching the launch, and it was just devastating. Obviously, I knew everybody on board. I knew their families very well. And I have to say, we knew flying in space was risky, but we were still pretty unprepared for Challenger and for Columbia. It is something I still think about. As weird as it might sound, I actually rescued a plant from Dick Scobie's office. He was the commander of Challenger, and I still have it growing. So it's a reminder, that he was a good friend and a good colleague. It was a terrible blow, as was the Columbia accident. In that same tradition, I have African violets by my sink that were in Laurel Clark's office, and Laurel was a physician who was aboard the Columbia, as well as Dave Brown, who was also a physician on the Columbia.
That's an amazing tribute to both of your colleagues. It's very touching to hear that. I wonder if the two of you could share with us what you actually did on your missions scientifically, or how did you use your medical knowledge, if at all? And Robert, what about your oncologic knowledge? Was that useful at all?
Fortunately, no use for the oncology training in space. I got to use the orthopedic training. One of the most common problems is back pain. First few days when you're in space, we attribute it to, you're going into weightlessness, and all of a sudden there's these fluid shifts. You get more fluid in your intervertebral disc. Everybody gets taller.
Well, let's send Pat to space.
We need to get up there soon, Dave.
We actually, during our visit, we measured how everybody's height, and just so that we know what that change was. And we did do a experiment, actually, that my background came very useful for. We were looking at the effects of bisphosphonates on bone loss. So bisphosphonates, well, everybody knows this is ASCO, class of drugs that anti-resorptives used in patients with bone metastases. It was actually being tested in rats, thinking about countermeasures for keeping people from losing bone on long duration space trips. Unfortunately, bisphosphonates come with a lot of side effects, but it did seem to, work in terms of the bone mass, which is induced by weightlessness in rats. And then finally, I was the crew medical officer for my group because I was the only MD up there in our crew. Ellen probably was the same with hers. And so, what that involves is, NASA was one of the first places to pioneer the use of telemedicine. So, you're basically communicating with the flight surgeons on the ground every day, talking about what sort of medical issues there are with the crew and getting their recommendations for dealing with whatever there is. So, being a doctor actually came very much in handy.
I was going to ask both of you, during your flights, did you encounter any medical emergencies without violating HIPAA? I mean, did you have to do an appendectomy?
No appendectomies, and fortunately, no emergencies. Astronauts are pretty well scrutinized and examined before flights. And I think the best insurance against a medical problem in space is to send crews that are really fit and really healthy. And of course, there's always the risk of things like trauma, but the risk is actually fairly low. So no emergencies on my flight.
There's no RVUs up there, are there, that you have to worry about billing, or no?
No, we didn't have to deal with third-party payers.
This is looking more and more like a job I want to pursue here. I'm going to be taller and there's no billing. This is great.
I want to hear from Helen what sort of experiments she was involved in and how her medical background helped her assist with that.
Yeah, people think, if you're a doctor and you're an astronaut, they selected you to be a doctor in space. But in fact, astronauts are selected sort of generically. So once you come into the office, you're trained as an astronaut. And Bobby and I were both mission specialists as opposed to astronaut pilots. And so we received training on all sorts of different things. Bobby did a spacewalk. I trained for spacewalks, but never did one. We trained on the remote arm. We trained how to fix things when they're broken. I was actually a flight engineer on one of my flights. But that aside, I was also the crew medical officer. And on every flight, astronauts participate in medical experiments because we are trying to gather lots of information from very few people on the physiologic effects of spaceflight, particularly looking towards longer flights, perhaps back to the moon or to Mars. So I did participate as a subject. I was an operator in a few medical experiments, but the bulk of my responsibilities actually were not medical. And I think, Bobby, maybe you would agree with that. We did have some flights that were designated as what I would call space life sciences flights, but there was only a handful of them, and I was not a crew member on any of those flights.
Boy, I could spend another 3 hours on this, and I would love to hear more stories.
This concludes part one of our interview with former NASA astronauts, Drs. Ellen Baker and Robert Satcher. Please be sure to tune in to part two of the interview, where we will learn more about the incredible work they're doing in their post-NASA careers. Thank you for tuning in to Oncology, Etc., an ASCO educational podcast. If you have an idea for a topic or guest you would like us to interview, please email your suggestion to education@asco.org. Thank you for making Oncology, Etc. a part of your day.
Thank you for listening to the ASCO Education Podcast. To stay up to date with the latest episodes, please click subscribe. Let us know what you think by leaving a review. For more information, visit the Comprehensive Education Center at education.asco.org.
The purpose of this podcast is to educate and to inform. This is not a substitute for professional medical care and is not intended for use in the diagnosis or treatment of individual conditions. Guests on this podcast express their own opinions, experience, and conclusions. Guest statements on the podcast do not express the opinions of ASCO. The mention of any product, service, organization, activity, or therapy should not be construed as an ASCO endorsement.